Right. So, in the last session, we have discussed about the architecture part we have started in context to the cloud architecture, especially AWS Azure related stuff. At the same time, we have discussed even about artificial intelligence and machine learning implementation part. And today, I'm going to discuss about what are the skill sets or what are the responsibilities being into infrastructure architect from the cloud environment, especially when we are working on AML environment. What are the responsibilities that are required for us to maintain and manage is something which I'm going to explain in today's session. The first one about being into infrastructure architect role, because architects in the last session, if you remember, I have already explained you the list of architect roles like cloud architect, application architect, systems architect, data architect, solution enterprise, business architect, all that. That was discussed in the last session. Now I'm going to discuss about infrastructure architect role, because building the infrastructure for the kind of solution which is required now and then is needed. Because earlier we used to have on-premise solutions. Slowly organizations are moving from on-premise to the cloud environment so that infrastructural cost will come down. So if you are an infrastructure architect, the first one should be experiencing or one should be knowing about designing scalable AI and ML infrastructure is something which being into the architect role, one should be experiencing it. One must be knowing. This is something essentially required. So whenever we are working as a infrastructure architect here, because we should able in a position to design an artificial intelligence based machine learning infrastructure, majorly to understand about the designing part as well as the scalability part. It's always important for us to understand about the IWS process in AWS, because AWS is a cloud service provider, you know that. Being a AWS cloud service provider, it's always important for us to understand the infrastructure. What is that something are we using? Like AWS platform, because cloud services platforms will be of three types. One is infrastructure as a service, second is a platform as a service. The third one is about software as a service, three services. Infrastructure as a service is something which normally comes under the infrastructure part. This infrastructure as a service majorly uh, deals with different services we have like EC2 or S3. At the same time, SageMaker is also one of the services which are about the Lambda, right? So these are the different services that comes under the infrastructure part. Being into architect role, something we need to do it. At the same time, we should also ensure performance as well, because non-functional requirements, something which we need to understand. As far as non-functional requirements itself is concerned, we need to ensure uh, optimal performances followed by uh, the kind of deployment of the solution, which must be cost efficient. That is important, because implementing as well as ensuring the performance of the application, but it must be cost effective is something generally we need to see. This is the first thing which being into architect role, we must be knowing with. Second, we need to model and train deployment automation, because automating the deployment process by creating some pipelines, because that's where generally now and then we are following DevOps environment. Continuous development and integration implementation is what something we called as CI/CD, continuous integration and deployment and delivery. This is what CI/CD process is. So in this regard, so when we are modeling the deployment automation, right? So how this can be deployed, right? How this can be automated by creating different DevOps pipelines, creating different DevOps pipelines, say CAD pipelines and all. At the same time, whatever the required training that are to be needed, because I don't say training is an integral part of the infrastructure services as an architect, but it's always important for us to provide some basic insights over the creation of data pipelines, how this data pipeline has to be created so that the flow of the process of data should not have any confusion over here. This is something which we must be knowing. Next, validations, because deployment validations are important, because verifying and validating the data before you are deploying something. Further, there are different monitoring tools are we using, especially from the AWS point of view, because cloud service provider, either it can be an AWS or Azure, anything can be used. But AWS, why am I explaining? Because AWS is more prominent from the infrastructure side. So being into architect role, this is more or less will be more required for us, right? So that's the reason why there are different services we have, SageMaker and all. At the same time, we should be able in a position to step the required functionalities, followed by creating a code pipeline. All these things we have to do in the second level. The third one about data management and integration, right? So how the data can be managed, how the data can be created and integrated, managed it, right? So what are the different data pipelines which are required for us to create? At the same time, how the pre-process will be taken place. At the same time, storing the large data sets which are essentially required for artificial intelligence and machine learning. So for that, there are different tools, something like AWS Glue or Redshift, I think. So these are the different tools, especially from the infrastructure point of view. Being in architect role, we must be good with. Next, we need to understand the security compliances, because security compliance standards, policies, procedures, this is also one of the core and important element. We must ensure the infrastructure, which must be adhered to the securities best practices as well as industry regulations. At the same time, whatever the AWS security features, we have something like IAM, identity access management, right? So to have identity access management, we have tools we call it as SailPoint, right? So we have different tools like SailPoint we are using outside for IAM. Even for AWS security features, we have IAM as well. At the same time, whatever VPC or encryption mechanism or KMS, everything comes under the security and compliances point of view. Next, being into architect level, we should be able in a position to optimize the infrastructure by assuming whatever the cost which is involved in it, how this can be performed, continuous performance monitoring. At the same time, what are the different costs that are using something like AWS auto scaling or elastic load balancing, spot instances. Everything comes under the optimizing infrastructure point of view. Next one about the high availability and fault tolerances, because fault tolerance is important. Fault tolerance means, let's say, if there is any changes or if there is any errors happens on the application, that application, it should not be impacted on the whole application. That is something which we call it as fault tolerance. Means we have to develop an application in such a way, it must be fault tolerance mode, so that if there is any kind of faults were identified in the application, it shouldn't be impacted on the whole application. That's the reason now and then we are following an architecture style which is called microservices architecture we are using. So we need to design the high availability of machine learning infrastructure by creating some multi-region setups, or at the same time implementing some redundancy strategies, followed by the kind of backup solutions to minimize the downtime. All these things are comes under the high availability and fault tolerances are concerned. Next, we need to monitor the login, right? So implementing the monitoring process, login solutions, and the wherein for whatever the artificial intelligence and machine learning workloads we have, something for AWS CloudWatch, at the same time X-Ray, right? So these are the something services which are majorly useful for us to track the performance and detect the anomalies, right? So if you have identified any detecting the anomalies, right? So tracking the performance, everything comes under the monitoring point of view. Next is collaboration, collaborating with science, data science teams. That is also one of the core and important element, right? So because data scientists majorly focusing on managing the data, right? So by using different uh, tools they were using. Okay, so we need to, being an architect, we should able in a position to work closely with some data scientists. At the same time, even with DevOps teams, because DevOps, because earlier the structure is such a way where development and operations are separate. Implementation used to do someone, and deployment used to be taken care of in others. That's how earlier was. But nowadays the situation has changed in such a way where both development and operations has to be in hand. This is where DevOps process comes into picture. Followed by this, what are the machine learning uh, engineers, right? So even we need to discuss with gathering in machine learning engineers and all, because this is something to gather the requirements. Because it's not something as a BA we do, because gathering of requirements not from the BA point of view I'm talking about. Gathering of requirements and all, translating into a scalable infrastructure solutions is what something which being into infrastructure architect we must be knowing, so that we can tailor according to the requirement, we can tailor it and we can do it. That is what something which normally we do. This is where general collaboration comes into picture, so that whatever the workloads we are going to maintain under AML workloads, everything can be maintained. So these are the major responsibilities being into an infrastructure architect, especially when we are working on the cloud infrastructure, especially when we use AWS. This is what something which being into architect role we have to perform. And tomorrow I'm going to discuss about the first one. Okay, so how this designing and scalable, right? How to design AML infrastructure. So before getting into that, anyway, I have told you about ML infrastructure earlier. I'll repeat the same again. So I'll repeat you about the machine learning infrastructure, followed by this, how this can be designed, everything. So that I'm going to discuss with you in tomorrow's session. Okay. Right. Thank you.